Hey friends, Eli here, as usual, and Mr. Bailey, and Zoe, and Waffles, but mostly me. Today I'm here to talk about rule number 7, and how I intentionally broke it, because that's how I spent the last week, planning to break one of my rules, a rule that I made to stay alive, mind you, on purpose, and then actually doing it. In my defense, Zoe encouraged me, and it really did seem like our best option at the time. Let me back up. First of all, because you all seem to be taking great delight in me and Zoe growing closer, I'll just go ahead and say what you probably want to know. I've slept in Zoe's bed with her every night since we found the door in the dome. And yes, it's still just sleeping. I'm not a creep. Honestly, I think it just comforts both of us to be able to reach out and know that each other is still there, still breathing, and still safe. I know it comforts me. It's so much better than going home and worrying all night that she won't be there in the morning when I go to meet up with her again. Also, to be fair, it is safer for both of us to spend as much time as possible in the soundproof, cameraless room. Rule number 12. I didn't break that one. After that first night, Zoe talked to Waffles. I went back to my place and gathered up most of my stuff to move back to the bookstore while she did this, because we'd come to the unspoken agreement that I'd basically be living there from now on. Partially because it was going to be a long conversation too. Since Waffles can't talk, it's a lot of yes or no questions and noises that only Zoe knows how to interpret. Plus, he's kinda shy, and I think he'd prefer it to be just Zoe anyway. By the time I got back, they'd had a whole talk, and Zoe was sitting in one of the chairs reading The Green Mile. When Mr. Bailey and I walked in, my pack duffel over my shoulder, she leapt up, tossing the book back onto the chair behind her. "Come on," she stage whispered, grabbing my hand and pulling me up the stairs. Mr. Bailey trotted up after us, and once he'd followed us into the room, she quickly shut the door behind him. First things first. Do you know the last line in The Green Mile? It's so damn good. We each owe a death. There are no exceptions. I know that. But sometimes, oh god, The Green Mile is so long. She sighed. Just awesome. I stared at her blankly, and she rolled her eyes. Trust me, it's good. Have you read any books? I read all of the Harry Potter and Percy Jackson books when I was a kid, I said helpfully. Anyway, about Waffles? Right, she said, taking her usual spot cross-legged on the mattress. I took mine in the desk chair, and Mr. Bailey took up his position not on my shoulder, but on Zoe's lap. He almost always sat there when we hung out and talked in here. I was getting a little worried that he actually did like her better. He would like me to confirm that he does not like Zoe better. He still loves me most, but her lap is comfy, and she gives good pets. Thank God. Waffles doesn't remember many details. He hadn't been alive very long, and everything seemed so overwhelming. But he knows it was a room with white walls. I showed him some photos, and he thinks they were concrete. He was packed in there with a whole herd of wolfbeans. Brents, right? I nodded. There was a noise like machinery and some shaking, and then a big door opened ahead of them, and they emerged out into the city. At the edge of the dome? I asked. He doesn't remember where, she said. It was all so crazy those first few days, and they covered a lot of ground. He tried really hard, but he can't remember. That's okay, I said, doing my best to keep my disappointment at bay. It wasn't Waffles' fault. Besides, he was still giving us a pretty decent lead, all things considered. We'll just have to think about this logically. Concrete, big doors, possible machinery. We both sat in silence for a long moment, Zoe absent-mindedly stroking Mr. Bailey's fur. Finally, she jerked her head up in realization. A hardware store, she said excitedly. Think about it. He could have heard any of the appliances or tools they have, and a warehouse fits the description. Plus, they're always full of monsters. Maybe they're full because the monsters came through the dome there and just never left. I was shaking my head before she even finished talking. Nope, no, I said. Or as they say in Spanish, no. We're just guessing at this point, and until we know, it's not worth it. What? Why? She said. Have you forgotten what you just said? They're always full of monsters. I literally have a rule about them. They're bad news, Zoe. She gently pushed Mr. Bailey off her lap and came over to me, taking my hands in hers. I know they are, she said softly. But the longer we wait, the more likely that we die before we find a way out. Especially if that note was more than an empty threat. Okay, I may have lied when I said it didn't scare us at all. I groaned. God, I know. I just really don't want to go back to a hardware store. It'll be like walking to that concert hall all over again, only this time I'm walking to a monster horde on purpose. She grinned. So you're down to do it? Of course I'll do it, I said. Like how I'd let you go alone. And I know you would if I said no. I'll just complain bitterly the whole time. And keep reminding you of rule number 7. And when we inevitably suffer a terrible attack, I'll repeat I told you so until my dying breath. Sounds like a deal, she said. Let's get started. Then she kissed my cheek and leapt to her feet, leaving me staring in shock as she blushed a deep shade of red. It was adorable. So the next few days were spent planning and trying to pinpoint which hardware store was the best bet. We ended up choosing a Home Depot a few miles away, because it backed up to the dome. If there was a hardware store where it would be easy to send monsters in from the outside, that would be it. Now is probably a good time to mention rule number 7, since I was already actively breaking it at this point. Rule number 7. Don't go to hardware stores. All the supplies in the world aren't worth it. The slogan may be more saving, more doing. That's the power of Home Depot. But the only real power of Home Depot is more dying. The reason for this rule is probably self-explanatory. You've already heard me talk about my aversion to hardware stores and the cause. They're cesspools of monsters. Something about them makes monsters want to hang out there. I always assumed it was the high ceilings and cool dark warehouse feel, but maybe there's something more. Maybe they're where monsters enter the dome. It wouldn't be the weirdest possibility. Regardless, all the fantastic supplies that I could maybe get at one just aren't worth the risk. Sure, I might be able to get tools or materials or makeshift weapons, but there's also at least an 80% chance I'd die a brutal death. The more dying part isn't only theoretical either. I once went to a Home Depot with a few other people several months into this mess, and it did not end well. Long story short, I'm the only one who made it out alive, and even that was mostly by luck. All this to say that I haven't gone to a hardware store since, and I wasn't excited about doing it now. Rule number 7 exists for a good reason. Arguably, several good reasons, and I make enough dumb decisions that I didn't want to break it on purpose. But Zoe was right. Plus, I'd break all my rules if it meant getting out of here. So we spent several days scouting out the Home Depot and making plans. It's impossible to prepare completely without knowing what monsters are in there, but we still did our best to plot the raining of hell on those motherfuckers. How? Well, I'm glad you asked. My duffel filled with Molotov cocktails and makeshift bombs. Turns out they're surprisingly easy with a little research. Extra knives on both our belts, good for throwing. Bulletproof vests. We raided a police station which was totally decimated but had a few intact vests and pistols under the rubble. We took them all. I mean, hey, the police won't be needing them anymore. What are they gonna do, arrest us for stealing from them? They're dead. By yesterday, we felt we were as ready as we were ever going to be, which meant it was time. We went in the late morning and stood there outside for a minute, the four of us. It's one thing to talk about it, and another to do it, after all. Finally, I broke the silence by saying, well, I'm ready to kick some monster ass. You ready? Zoe nodded. Waffles made a little whine sound that I'm 90% sure means yes, and Mr. Bailey chirped, which I'm 100% sure means yes. Great, I said. Let's do this thing and hopefully not die trying. So we walked in, vests on and knives pressing into our thighs and my duffel heavy over my shoulder. Zoe held her axe tightly, and I gripped a pistol in each hand. They're still not my favorite, but I've been making a real effort to get better at using them. My progress is pretty impressive, if I do say so myself. And yes, we simply walked in the front door. The other option was through the garden center, which was a horrible idea, because it was guaranteed to be full of Sandras. And even though we had earplugs and 2 pairs of noise-canceling headphones with us, the singing, if we went that way, would alert the entire store's monster population to our whereabouts immediately. No thank you. We don't need any help giving ourselves away. Now, let me give you a little glimpse into our thought process here. There shouldn't be any Ashleys here because there was no food. It was pretty safe to bet that there weren't any Dylans since they're almost always outside and at night, or any Mikes since they're rare as hell. We were probably safe from MJs since they generally target people who are alone, and as long as we stayed out of the garden center, we shouldn't see any Sandras. That means that our biggest concerns, and the ones we'd planned for the most, were Caleb's and Brent's. Luckily, they can both be killed by various means of brute force and violence. I know that supposedly violence isn't always the answer, however, I think in some cases, violence is the question and yes is the answer. Just saying. Anyway, there we were, in the front of the Home Depot. It was pretty dark because all the lights had been broken or were worn out months ago. We could only see the shadowy aisles by sunlight, streaming in through the once large windows and now large holes in the front wall behind us. Zoe had a flashlight, but we had agreed we'd only turn it on when we got closer to the back of the store, where the sunlight didn't reach, in order to avoid drawing monster attention for as long as possible. Everything actually went pretty well for the first 5 minutes or so, might be a new record. Zoe and I walked slowly side by side, taking cautious, quiet steps and constantly scanning around us for movement. Mr. Bailey was on my shoulder, his head on a continuous rotation, but he was quiet. I hope this meant that there weren't any monsters extremely nearby. Waffles walked behind us, and he too was on the lookout, though I think he may have been focusing more on being quiet, since he's not exactly built for stealth. We were beelining for the back of the store, since we figured any door would be there, where the store's walls nearly met up with the dome. There was a gap of only a few feet between them, if that. And we knew we didn't have limitless time before monsters realized we were here, so checking the most likely place first seemed like the logical thing to do. And it probably was, but unfortunately for us, we didn't have much time to investigate the back wall before things went to shit. We had been there for all of 2 minutes. Zoe had her flashlight on and was shining it up and down the wall, looking for anything weird. "Does this look familiar at all?" she whispered to Waffles. He made a little whining noise, but before Zoe could translate for me, Mr. Bailey suddenly started meowing his head off. And, well, we all knew what that meant. Zoe, Waffles, and I spun around, and by the beam of Zoe's flashlight we saw a flash of movement behind a shelf. It was too quick to tell what it was. Between Mr. Bailey's meows, I was now beginning to hear scuffles and growls, and my heart dropped. because I wasn't just hearing one growl. It was a chorus. Another blur of movement in the shadows, and Zoe swung her flashlight but wasn't fast enough to catch it. Another one, but this one to our left, at least 15 feet away from the first. And another, and another. Zoe stopped trying to aim her flashlight in time and set it on the ground, giving us some light but leaving both her hands free. I slowly set my duffel on the floor between us, keeping my eyes on the movements in the shadows as I unzipped it with one hand. I opened the flap, revealing the dozens of homemade bombs inside, and straightened back up. Zoe and I looked at each other, and I could tell we both thought we were as ready as we'd ever be. Plus the noises were growing louder, and the movements were getting closer. I swear I could see eyes glinting in the aisles. So I gripped my pistol tighter, and yelled, "Come on then, cowards! What are you waiting for, an invitation? Well, here it is. Come and get us." Now, I don't think they understood me, although at this point, who knows, but my voice sure got their attention. And as soon as the last word had left my mouth, they were charging us from all directions. I barely had time to register what they were, some mix of Brents and Caleb's, I think, before I was fighting for my life. Zoe had shifted her axe to one hand and was swinging wildly with it to keep them at bay, while she ducked and grabbed bombs in her other hand, throwing them as quickly as she touched them. I followed suit, squatting, throwing. Only a few seconds later, the first few exploded. The store lit up in brilliant flashes of fire and monster guts. These weren't super fancy bombs or anything, obviously, but I'll be damned if they weren't doing the trick. Sweat was dripping down my face, both from the rapid squats and throws and from the heat of the explosions. At least there was more light now. Between burning monster carcasses and a nearby shelf that had caught on fire, I could see much better than I had with only the flashlight. We kept going, and for a few minutes, it was working. The bombs exploded on impact, so even our aim didn't matter that much. Whether they hit monster flesh or the floor, they'd detonate just the same, and any nearby monsters would suffer the consequences. Howls and screams filled the air as Caleb's and Brent's were set aflame, or injured by the shockwaves, or blown to bits entirely. The bombs were small scale, but they were big enough to take out a few monsters per bomb, especially those that happened to land conveniently. And sure, we were suffering too. We weren't that far from the blasts after all. Monster blood and bits sprayed across my clothes and face, and I could feel my skin beginning to blister from the heat. My shirt was drenched with sweat. A quick glance at Zoe revealed that she was feeling the same effects. Her hair and shirt were soaked, her skin was red and even peeling on her hands. But hey, we were mostly killing the monsters before they got within a dangerous range. And those that were sneaking through, we were able to finish off with a couple of axe swings or bullets to the head. So all things considered, we were doing better than we would have if we'd been fighting them directly. Except that then we ran out of bombs. We'd made as many as we could in a week, but it turns out we would have needed a year to make enough. Zoe and I simultaneously reached for the duffel to grab another bomb, only to feel nothing except the bottom of the bag in each other's sweaty hands. We looked at each other. "Fuck," I said. "Fuck," she agreed. The smoke left behind by the explosions filled the air in front of us. As it began to clear, we saw just how screwed we were. Over the body parts and shrapnel fragments, emerging from the smoke, came more hordes. Caleb's and Brent's climbing over their fallen buddies like it meant nothing, and so many of them. We may as well not have just blown up like 50 of them. They were advancing in something of a semicircle around us, backing us up to the wall. "We have to clear a path to get out of here," said Zoe. I pulled out my second pistol. "Bring it," I said. I looked to Mr. Bailey and added, "Well, we might die. I love you, buddy. Let's do this." He chirped in response. I like to think he was saying that he loved me too. Then I looked back to Zoe, and I wanted to say something similar to her. I did. But with her it was harder. I opened my mouth to say it, but she simply winked at me, gripped her axe, and yelled, "Die, motherfuckers!" before charging forward to meet the monsters. Well, I guess my only option was to make sure we didn't die, so that I didn't have to regret not telling her something before we kicked the bucket. "What she said!" I yelled, taking aim and firing both pistols at once. One hit a Brent in the chest, and the other nailed a Caleb in the head, slowing both of them down enough for Zoe to axe them. Beautiful. Waffles got in on the action too, and honestly, he might have been the most helpful of all. He fucking decimated several of his fellow Brents in the blink of an eye. Mr. Bailey jumped on the nearest Caleb and started scratching the ever-living hell out of its eye holes. Even in the insanity of frantically firing more bullets, I was able to feel grateful that I wasn't alone. Mr. Bailey had always been great, but having a whole team was even better. At this point, I'd emptied both my pistols and had to pause to reload. The whole time I glanced up repeatedly, worried about Zoe, but Waffles had her covered. I saw Brent try to stab her with its scorpion tail, and it got awfully close. Waffles let out a terrifying roar and leapt onto that Brent, tackling it to the ground and ripping out its throat. A Caleb got close enough to me to claw up my arm as I reloaded, and I groaned as blood welled up in the long scratches. But now I was ready to fire. I raised the pistol, aimed, and shot the Caleb right through its eye socket. It screeched and fell back, and I followed, firing another 4 shots into its head. Thick purple liquid oozed from the bullet holes. Fuck that Caleb. Fuck original Caleb too while we're at it. The battle was still raging all around us, but by now we were making some progress, and the monster numbers were lessening. A path was emerging along the wall to my right. We could run and check the wall at the same time. "Zoe, Waffles, come on!" I yelled, gesturing wildly at the gap in the monster horde by me. Zoe axed another Caleb and glanced back at me. She seemed to put it together quickly enough to act. She ducked to avoid the claws of a Brent and raced over to me, taking off along the wall, holding her axe between her and the monsters. Waffles tore apart the Brent that had just swung at Zoe. I think he took any monsters attacking her as a personal offense, and began to back up towards me, still biting and swiping at any advancing monsters. When he reached my side, he didn't follow Zoe, though. Instead, he made a whining noise. And I swear that this time, I knew what he meant. He wanted me to go first. He'd wait and come last. He'd hold them off. "Thank you," I said sincerely. "You better be right behind me." Then I was off, Mr. B hot on my heels. I couldn't see Zoe ahead of me in the dim light, but I figured I'd just follow the wall and hope she'd done the same. A few monsters popped up out of the darkness. One Brent even got close enough to stab me in the chest with its tail. Thank God for the bulletproof vest, or I'd be dead. I had to empty my pistols again, and this time I had no spare bullets. I cursed and stuck them in the holsters on my belt, replacing them with 2 of the knives hanging there. I'd already had to throw one of those by the time I caught up with Zoe. She was crouched in the back corner of the store, behind some appliances. She looked up in alarm, her axe raised when she heard me approaching, but sighed in relief when she saw it was me. I crouched low beside her. "There's nothing here," she whispered. "No doors, nothing weird along the wall, nothing. It's useless." "Okay, well, let's book it out of here then," I said. She shook her head. "We can't. Stand up." I cautiously did, and realized that from here I could see the front door. Even though we were in the back, enough shells had been destroyed or knocked over, or set on fire, oops, that I could see the door and the sunlight streaming in through the holes that used to be windows. Well, that's not exactly true. I couldn't see the door. I could see where the door was supposed to be, but I couldn't see it because it was blocked by yet another herd of monsters, who weren't moving towards the explosions, but were instead waiting patiently, lined up like an army ready for battle in a Lord of the Rings movie. And there was no way we had enough firepower or energy left to get past all of them and fight our way out through that door. "Fuck," I said. "Fuck," Zoe agreed. There was a commotion behind us, and I spun around, heart beating in my throat, but it was Waffles. We both sighed in relief. "Well," I said, "I hope you like flowers, Waffles, because it looks like we're going through the garden center." He didn't seem pleased, but we had no choice. It was the only other exit. Zoe and I each quickly put in earplugs and then noise-canceling headphones over those too, readied the couple of Molotov cocktails stashed in our pockets, and made for the garden center. I won't get into the details here, but it went how you'd expect. The double layering of earplugs and headphones worked surprisingly well, though I still had a hell of a headache afterwards. Not even noise-canceling headphones can totally block out the effect of 10 Sandras singing at once. There was some fire, some knife-throwing, and again, Waffles crushed it. He tore apart a few of them, leaving shredded mushrooms as the only sign they'd ever been there. Honestly, Waffles was the MVP of that ill-fated trip. Let's hear it for Waffles. The singing, of course, alerted the rest of the monsters where we were, but by the time they got there, we were already outside and running away as fast as our legs could carry us. A few followed, but they were easy to pick off. Most stayed in the Home Depot. I guess that's their home now, and they didn't want to leave it. Who knows? As long as they weren't coming after me, I wasn't going to question it. We got back to the bookstore shortly before it got dark. After some serious first aid for myself and Zoe, who both had a lot of scratches and burns, and more minor first aid for Waffles and Mr. Bailey, we settled in for the night. I'm just glad we found those vests and planned ahead, because it could have been so much worse. I'm much better off than I was after the concert hall fiasco, for example. We sat around talking after that, about our disappointment that the Home Depot was a dead end, about the possibility of trying another hardware store, and of course I brought up rule number 7 several times, just for the I told you so moment I felt I deserved. Zoe mentioned how Waffles said nothing there had seemed familiar. He remembered the concrete room being a lot smaller, and it didn't have supplies in it like that. It was just empty, and there was the shaking all around. She was in the middle of wondering aloud if we should decide on another hardware store to investigate when an idea occurred to me, and I jumped to my feet as if I'd sat on a thumbtack or something. "Shit!" I exclaimed. "We're so stupid! Zoe, it's not a hardware store!" He heard machinery and the whole room shook. There was nothing in that hardware store that would do that, but a small room that's empty yet still shakes and makes noise? It's an elevator! I felt the same sense of accomplishment as when I just solved one of her riddles. She gaped at me in shock. I could practically see the wheels turning in her head. Then she jumped to her feet too. "It would make sense," she said excitedly. "They're coming from underground. If we can find the elevator, we can get out, and we can find where the monsters are coming from," I finished. "But an elevator could be anywhere," she said. "I know," I said, "but figuring out where an elevator is sure beats the hell out of going to another Home Depot. I'm perfectly happy never fucking with rule number 7 again. I don't need to prove the real power of Home Depot. I know that place sucks." Yeah, rule number 7, I get it," she said, rolling her eyes. "Now let's find ourselves an elevator." She smiled at me, and even though my skin was blistered and burning with the fire of 1,000 suns, and my arm was hurting like hell, I had hope again, and it felt like the best thing in the world when she looked at me like that. So I couldn't help but smile back.